A change in the housing debate, maybe. Is it really a human rights issue? Now, that's the unexpected tone introduced into the vexed subject of home ownership by New Zealand's Human Rights Commission this week. It launched an inquiry into the housing crisis across the ditch. In the past year, New Zealand property prices have rocketed by 30%. Our highest in Sydney of 16% rises look maybe modest, just for a moment. And as Alan Kohler told us on ABC News this week, it's happening in virtually every country. So it prompts the question, are unstoppable forces at play here, far bigger than individual aspirations or government settings? Or are choices being made by governments and authorities, implicitly or explicitly, about intergenerational wealth? Choices with moral overtones that we've tended to ignore. To tease out more than the usual about interest rates, taxes, supply and so on, I welcome Bernard Hickey, a New Zealand-based independent writer and analyst of economics and housing, and Saul Eslake, an independent economist and Vice-Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Tasmania, who says, for instance, that we've been in a 30-year property bubble, inflated by government policy and propped up whenever it looks like popping. Thank you both for joining us.
Morena.
Thank you for having me here this morning.
Bernard, does this move change the nature of the debate? Because I noticed that the Human Rights Commission is saying that the disproportionately affected marginalised people and the implication they're creating more of them. It seemed different to me.
That's right. New Zealand does have a Human Rights Act, and we have signed up to the United Nations human rights agreements. So that gives it a legal element, which we hadn't really thought about before. New Zealand, you're right, as you mentioned in your introduction, has an enormously unaffordable market, not just for first home buyers, but also for renters. So New Zealand's rental affordability is the worst in the OECD. We have the most number of poorer people paying more than 40% of their disposable income in rent. And we now have more than 26,000 families who are officially registered as homeless. The government's spending upwards of $5 million a day on subsidies for housing and putting people up in motels. So we have a social crisis, a health crisis actually. Our emergency departments have been overwhelmed by people who have come in with chest infections, skin infections, often from living in substandard housing. So for the first time, the Prime Minister, who has a reputation overseas for being a kind and compassionate and competent leader, is now being challenged directly by people on the left of politics, I suppose, who say this isn't just a financial issue or an economic issue, it's a human rights issue and you need to do something about it.
And is there a sense of people wringing their hands but saying there aren't things to be done, or is there a sense that levers could be pulled differently?
That's right. It's been going on for 20 years now, the crisis. In fact, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern was elected in large part in 2017 because she described the situation as a crisis. However, since she was elected, prices rose another 50%. And the size of the numbers of people on the housing register who are out of housing has actually quadrupled on her watch. There are plenty of levers that the government could pull, but it's chosen not to because it's realised, like other governments before it, that median voters, the people you really need to get to win an election, are mostly homeowners. And in New Zealand, where we don't have a capital gains tax, those people have become stonkingly rich under this arrangement.
It's astonishing to think you don't have a capital gains tax. I didn't realise that this week.
Yeah, it's been right at the heart of our political debates. So in Australia, climate change has been the thing that's pushed prime ministers in and out of power and being the real point of pain for political parties from both sides of the spectrum. But in New Zealand, it's been the capital gains tax. Right. So the last 4 elections have been all about should we have one or shouldn't we? And the parties that promoted a capital gains tax lost every time because there is so much at stake for those people who own houses now. They have $1.5 trillion in their houses, and many base their small businesses and their personal financial arrangements off the equity in their houses. So So it's very hard, once house prices have risen, to ever think about trying to get them back down again.
Saul, does this ring true to you at all? You know, what are the sort of comparisons you might make with here?
Well, I suppose the first observation I'd make is that while there are people in Australia who think, as Bernard has explained in New Zealand, that there is a human rights dimension to the housing problems that we have in Australia, unfortunately, because Australia is the only democracy in the world that doesn't have any human rights provisions in its constitution and which hasn't signed up to or ratified the UN conventions on human rights, you couldn't do what is now being proposed in New Zealand in Australia. That's the same reason why the Australian government has been able to impose restrictions on the movements of its own citizens across the border that no other democracy in the world has been able to or wanted to do during COVID. But in the context of housing here, yes, the numbers are very similar. We do have a capital gains tax, and I would say New Zealand has one for residential property, except for reasons that Bernard might be able to explain. They call it a bright line test. They don't apply it to capital gains on shares, but we've had a similar explosion in house prices over a longer period, less dramatic in the last 2 years than it has been in New Zealand, but over the last 30 years, house prices across Australia have risen by an average of 314%. To put that in some perspective, average weekly earnings for full-time adults have risen by 171%. So if you like, the ratio of house prices to average incomes has almost doubled over that period. Consumer prices, by contrast, have only risen by about 90% over the last 30 years. The value of housing wealth held in the form of residential property has risen in this country by about $5.75 trillion, or about 708%. Again, as in New Zealand, that's why, because 11 million or so Australians own at least one property, and more than 2 million Australians own two or more, or own at least one investment property. That's why they like that. At the other end of the spectrum, the amount that those who rent have been paying in rent has risen by 713% over the last 30 years. And of course, most of that rent goes to the people who own investment properties. Some of it goes to government agencies and social housing authorities and so forth, but most of it goes to people who own investment properties. And of course, because of loopholes in the tax law like negative gearing and the discount that applies to capital gains, they don't pay nearly as much tax on that rental income as people who earn similar amounts through wages and salaries do.
Yes, you seem to be in a recent, I thought, pretty sort of concise piece you wrote for the Saturday paper. You seem to be suggesting that sort of the intergenerational pact that has really governed Australian life post-war was breaking down. And I thought you were implying it was sort of almost like a moral issue that we hadn't really taken into account. But you also said that governments prop up this bubble. Now, what are you getting at there?
Well, yes, there's a number of things to unpack there. Australia's retirement income system, for example, depends as an almost unstated pillar on the assumption that the vast majority of Australians will have owned their own house outright by the time they reach retirement age, and hence will have very low housing costs apart from repairs and maintenance and council rates. And traditionally, the small proportion of Australians who weren't able to achieve outright home ownership, having paid off their mortgage by the time they reached retirement age, would be looked after in social housing, where their rent would be fixed as a percentage of their pension. But that's increasingly no longer the case. There's a growing proportion of the population who will reach retirement age over the next 20 years without having paid off their mortgage in full. They'll use their superannuation quite rationally to pay off their mortgage, and then where will their income come from? There's also a growing proportion of people younger ages who will almost certainly never reach home ownership. I mean, as it is, the home ownership rate of the 2016 census among people under the age of 40 was lower than it had been at the census of 1954. And I wouldn't be surprised if, when the census that we're all filling out this week, results are reported in about June or July next year, that the home ownership rate among people aged under 40 will be lower than it was at the first post-war census in 1947. So, I'm surprised that there isn't more anger among young people at the way in which their parents' generation have, in effect, rigged the housing market against them, younger people, and in their own interests. And yes, whenever house prices do look wobbly, as they have done, for example, during the global financial crisis, and again during COVID, when this time last year, chief economists of the banks and others were warning that property prices could fall by 10, 20 or even more percent, two things happen. One, the central bank, the Reserve Bank, reduces interest rates, which was undoubtedly the right thing to do when we were faced with the worst recession in our history since the 1930s. But what also happens is that governments throw millions, if not billions of dollars at the housing market by way of grants to first homeowners in the completely mistaken belief that that increases the home ownership rate. We've been giving grants to first homeowners since 1964, and the home ownership rate has been going down ever since the first census after we started doing that in 1966. And, of course, the money that governments throw at first homeowners through grants or through state government stamp duty concessions ends up in the pockets of vendors. That's why I call them second home vendor grants, or in the profit margins of builders and developers. But because there are so many more people who already own at least one property than there are people seeking to become property owners for the first time, the public has a huge vested interest in property prices always going up, and governments pander to that.
Well, I mean, Bernard, I'm wondering whether you think there might be a constituency for changing the nature of the debate. I mean, part of the trouble for you is you've become this extraordinary destination for some of the world's wealthiest people who've decided, you hear it sort of about once a week, we'll all decamp to New Zealand if it all goes bad.
Yeah, that's one of the ironies, is that a lot of people think that New Zealand is a paradise without COVID, a clean, fantastic place. And in fact, Larry Page, the co-founder of Google, was revealed as a resident of New Zealand yesterday. And we have quite a thriving business in some parts of the country, people building bunkers for billionaires to fly in on their private jets from San Francisco and maybe Sydney in future. However, the political economy of this is awfully wicked. So, for example, I thought the most fascinating piece of news in the last couple of weeks on both sides of the Tasman was the announcement from the Labour Party in Australia that it was going to pull out of its policies on negative gearing and those other essentially discounts for the housing market. The same thing has happened here in New Zealand. So Jacinda Ardern was elected in 2017 on a promise of bringing in a capital gains tax. But halfway through her first term, she was effectively pushed and bullied by a coalition partner and became effectively a political realist by saying, I will never do a capital gains tax in my political lifetime. And so the Labour Party has pulled back from policies that would try to reverse that intergenerational wealth transfer. And we don't have any parties in New Zealand with political power that would actually be able to push that back. So in a way, in Australia, the same thing has happened as here. Everyone acknowledges the problem, but when you try to change it, you effectively have to take wealth off the centrist voter who delivers you power. And Australia has just acknowledged the same thing. The Labour Party realises that it can't get into power if it tries to shift or remove the wealth of those who are older and who have more properties, as Saul points out. And we're in this horrible, I wouldn't call it a catch-22, but a situation where we know the problem, we know how to fix it. In fact, a lot of those people who are beneficiaries of the problem understand it as well. But we're looking into the distance going, well, I'm not going to solve it. That would hurt me. And this is the problem here. Until the young, we have a particular problem in New Zealand in that we don't have compulsory voting. So what we're seeing now is an increasing drop in the proportion of young people who are renters as voters. So even though we have a dominant group of people still who are homeowners, our home ownership rate is about 60%, although falling, it's going to take a long time for the political balance to switch in demographic terms so that you have a majority of renters able to finally call the shots.
To paraphrase Paul Keating, this is a debate we surely have to have. Look, gentlemen, very interesting. Thank you, Bernard Hickey and Saul Eslake.
Thank you for having me, Geraldine.
Bernard Hickey from New Zealand, an independent writer, and Saul Eslake,